So let's get started actually with the vocabulary on the back. And what I did is I broke it down into terms that are really technical so that you probably wouldn't quite understand how they're used, even if you looked them up in a dictionary, and terms which were more general. So let me start with etic and emic. These can be defined really simply as involving an outsider's point of view, right, and an insider's point of view. We're going to talk later today about a particular ritual that takes place in Morocco that Geertz talks about, where when two tribes in Morocco are trying to create a trade pact, amongst other things, they slaughter a lamb and recite Quranic texts, right? Texts from the most holy work of Islam, right? And from a completely, and by outsider's point of view, what's meant here is a completely outsider's point of view. Like you just landed from Mars and have no idea what they're doing, right? So from an outsider's point of view, all you can describe, right, is the actions that people undertake, right? He reached down with the knife and slaughtered the lamb. He said the following sounds out loud, and I don't even know what those sounds mean, right? But from an insider's point of view, from the emic point of view, you get a lot more meaning, right? He said these sounds, and that means these things, right? He slaughtered the lamb as a symbolic sacrifice, right? For symbolizing the sacrifices he was willing to make in order to make the trade pact and our relationship with each other work, and so on. So the insider's point of view is going to give you a sense of meaning, and the outsider's point of view gives you just strictly a material description, okay? So etic and emic are often important when anthropologists want to talk about the difference between this kind of strict material description of what's going on and some sort of account of what's actually significant in this case. Essentialism is another crucial one. Essentialism is a notion that's become much more important over the last 20 years or so, and it's been related to ideas especially of gender or race, right? So the idea of defining someone by their gender or race is basically saying there's something about that person that's essential, right? Kenny McGill is a man, and he acts the way he does because of his gender, his male identity, right? So that says there's something, and more to the point, right, this is more often done with women, right, that women act this way because they're women, or all women act that way, and so on. That's a form of gender essentialism, right? So when anthropologists accuse one another of essentialism, they're accusing one another of taking a certain kind of people to be the representatives of a certain kind of characteristic, and that characteristic defines them. Just as you'd be essentializing women or men to say that they all act a certain way because of their gender. All men like football, all women like X, right? Nomothetic, again another term that you're not likely to see outside of this kind of context, just means bound by rules. The idea is here that science, right, is a nomothetic system in the sense that science describes a universe that's bound by rules, like the rule that's incorporated in what we call the law of gravity. When I drop the chalk, it will fall down, right? So the idea here is if the universe is nomothetic, or if the universe is bound by rules, right, then it operates according to certain laws. And science is nomothetic, right? Science tries to find out laws about things. The thermodynamic law, the law of gravity, any other sort of, the sort of distribution, the sort of statistical distribution you might get in class grades or in preferences for TV shows or whatever, right? You could make an argument that all these things happen according to certain kinds of laws. Murder rates of, these are social things, but there's various physical things that people talk about as well. Okay, so the question is culture nomothetic? Is human society and human culture nomothetic? Is it bound by laws? Are there laws that can describe what other ways certain people are going to act across cultures? Okay, positivism, or epistemological is a word I've used before. Epistemological refers to the theory of knowledge, right? So an epistemology is a theory of knowledge. So I might have a small piece of knowledge, right? Let me give you a piece of ethnographic knowledge, right? Corn pollen is an important symbol of fertility in Apache culture, right? Apache culture, Arizona, Southwest Desert, United States, right? And a very important part of their culture is growing corn, right? And so corn pollen is a really important symbol of fertility, and it's used in a lot of ceremonies. So that's my knowledge. My theory of knowledge is, how can you know that? My theory of knowledge is, well, I have ethnographic methods, and I go and ask people, and I observe rituals where they use corn pollen, and then I analyze it, and I talk about the different ways in which people use corn pollen. And all this together, I have a theory of how I gain this knowledge, right? So anytime you have a theory about how you got your knowledge, you have an epistemology, right? So this is epistemological. And so the result, right, is when scientists and other academics or thinkers in general argue with each other, right, they're often arguing about epistemology. Yes, you know that, but how do you know that? What's your theory about how you know that, right? And it's not just that I think you don't know that. I think your theory about what knowledge is wrong. And in fact, you don't know what you think you know because your theory of knowledge is wrong, and so on. So epistemology is very important. Like positivism and logical positivism is, in a certain sense, one epistemology. It's the idea that all things can be known through the careful application of a sort of rational, logical system, right? A rational, logical method. By looking at things in a strictly logical way, we can understand it. The question for cultural anthropology, of course, right, is, can you understand every culture in the world merely by looking at it logically? Okay? Now, infrastructure. Did anyone notice the word infrastructure in Harris's essay? It's used in a very unique way, okay? He used infrastructure to mean just the typical actions that are undertaken by a group of people, right? What does the word infrastructure normally mean? Does anyone know what it normally means? Shannon, what do you associate that with? A business? Okay. Yeah.
Like a foundation.
A foundation. The infrastructure is the foundation for something. So infra means within, I suppose. Could be the foundation. Infrastructure is often talked about as like highways and bridges and dams and the electrical grid. So the infrastructure of the United States is all the material things that support our lives, right? Infrastructure is, this is the normal meaning of infrastructure. So when the electrical grid goes out, you can't go about your normal life because you don't have that foundation in the sense Sarah says, right? You don't have that substructure in a way, right? Yeah, sorry, infra means below, right? So foundation, below. You can't, when the electricity goes out, as it did for many people, it's hard to carry on your daily life and so on. He uses it in a very specific way. He says that culture does exist, but it's bound by an infrastructure, which is the kind of the habits and the normal actions of people, right? So I define it here as concrete material behaviors that people perform according to their background, right? So the idea is that if a culture changes and people's ideas change, it depends that the realization of those ideas depends on an infrastructure, which is a normal way of doing things. If there's a normal way of making a trade pact in Moroccan culture, right, then that's part of the infrastructure of Moroccan culture. It's a very unusual use of the word infrastructure. It does sort of accord with Sarah's notion of a foundation, right? But nevertheless, it's one you should be aware of if you're reading Harris. There's a couple more. One is Kula, which you don't really need to know, but it's mentioned by Geertz in passing. Again, this has to do with Melanesian culture. We've talked about Papua New Guinea before. There's a group of islands right off of Papua New Guinea where people had this ceremonial system called Kula, where they